The autumn of 1859 cast long shadows across Magnolia Grove Plantation in South Carolina, where the rigid social order that had governed the antebellum South for generations was about to be shattered by something as simple and dangerous as written words. In the quarters behind the grand mansion, 26-year-old Elijah worked by candlelight, his calloused hands moving carefully across a piece of stolen paper, forming letters that could cost him his life. Elijah was an anomaly among the enslaved population of Magnolia Grove. He could read and write, skills he had acquired in secret from the plantation's former tutor, an elderly man named Professor Whitman, who had taken pity on the intelligent young slave before his death 3 years prior. The knowledge was Elijah's most closely guarded secret, for literacy among slaves was not only forbidden but punishable by death in South Carolina. The object of Elijah's clandestine correspondence was Catherine Beaumont, the 19-year-old daughter of plantation owner Colonel Harrison Beaumont. Catherine was everything that Southern society expected of a planter's daughter: beautiful, refined, and educated in the accomplishments deemed suitable for a lady of her station. She spoke French, played piano, and had been groomed since childhood to marry well within Charleston's elite social circle. What Catherine was not supposed to be was in love with one of her father's slaves. The impossible romance had begun innocently enough 6 months earlier, when Catherine had been reading in the plantation's garden and dropped her book into the ornamental pond. Elijah, who had been tending the grounds nearby, had immediately waded in to retrieve it, despite the fact that such initiative from a slave could be seen as presumptuous. "Thank you," Catherine had said simply, accepting the dripping volume of poetry from his hands. Their eyes had met for just a moment, but in that brief exchange, something had passed between them that neither could explain or forget. "Miss Catherine," Elijah had replied, his voice carefully modulated to show the proper deference, though his intelligent eyes betrayed a depth that surprised her. Over the following weeks, Catherine had found excuses to walk in the garden when Elijah was working there. Their conversations began with simple exchanges about the weather or the flowers, but gradually evolved into discussions of literature, philosophy, and the world beyond the plantation's borders. Catherine was astonished to discover that this man, whom society deemed property, possessed a mind as sharp and cultivated as any gentleman of her acquaintance. "You've read Wordsworth?" she had asked one afternoon, after Elijah had quoted a passage from lines composed a few miles above Tintern Abbey. "Yes, miss," Elijah had replied carefully. I taught myself to read." The admission was dangerous, but Catherine's reaction had been wonder rather than alarm. "How extraordinary! You must have such a love of learning." "Learning is the one thing they cannot take from a man once he possesses it," Elijah had said, then immediately regretted the philosophical observation that revealed too much of his inner thoughts. But Catherine had not been offended by his words. Instead, she had begun bringing books to their secret meetings, sharing her favorite passages and engaging in literary discussions that would have been remarkable between any two educated individuals, let alone a slave and his master's daughter. The transformation from intellectual companionship to romantic love had been gradual and inevitable. Catherine found herself thinking constantly about their conversations, anticipating their meetings with an excitement that had nothing to do with literature. Elijah, for his part, was tormented by feelings he knew could only lead to disaster, yet found himself powerless to resist the pull of Catherine's intelligence, kindness, and beauty. The first letter had been Catherine's idea. "I wish we could continue our discussions even when we cannot meet," she had said one evening, as autumn began to paint the plantation's trees in shades of gold and crimson. "Miss Catherine," Elijah had said carefully, "such a thing would be dangerous." "Only if we were discovered," she had replied with the reckless confidence of youth. "But we could hide the letters. I know a place in the old oak tree by the creek where no one would think to look." Against his better judgment, Elijah had agreed. The exchange of letters had begun as an extension of their intellectual discussions, but had quickly evolved into something far more intimate and dangerous. Catherine wrote of her dreams, her frustrations with the limitations placed upon her as a woman, and her growing feelings for the man who had opened her mind to new ideas and possibilities. Elijah's letters, written in the elegant script that Professor Whitman had taught him, revealed a soul trapped between two worlds, too educated and sensitive to accept his bondage, yet too realistic to believe that love could overcome the insurmountable barriers of race and class that separated him from Catherine. "My dearest Catherine," he wrote in the letter that would ultimately seal his fate, "I know that what we feel for each other is impossible in this world, yet I cannot bring myself to regret it. You have shown me that love recognizes no boundaries save those we impose upon ourselves. If I am to die for loving you, then I will die knowing that I have experienced something pure and beautiful in a life that has known little of either." Catherine's response had been equally passionate and equally damning. "My beloved Elijah, society may call our love forbidden, but I believe that God sees only two souls who have found in each other a perfect complement. I would rather face any consequence than live without the hope that someday, somehow, we might be together." The letters had been hidden in the hollow of the ancient oak tree for 3 months when disaster struck. Thomas Beaumont, Catherine's younger brother, had been hunting near the creek when he had seen his sister retrieving something from the tree. Curious and suspicious, he had waited until she left and then investigated the hiding place himself. The discovery of the letters had sent shockwaves through the Beaumont household. Colonel Beaumont, a man whose sense of honor and social position was absolute, had flown into a rage that terrified even his own family. The idea that his daughter had been conducting a romantic correspondence with one of his slaves was not merely scandalous, it was a violation of every principle upon which his world was built. "Bring him to me," the colonel had commanded his overseer, his voice deadly calm in a way that was more frightening than any shouting could have been. Elijah had been working in the cotton fields when the overseer and 2 other white men had come for him. He had known immediately that their secret had been discovered, and as they bound his hands and marched him toward the main house, he had felt a strange sense of peace. The waiting was over. Catherine had been locked in her room, but she could hear the commotion as Elijah was brought to the house. She had pressed her face to the window, watching as the man she loved was forced to his knees in the courtyard below. Even from a distance, she could see the dignity with which he carried himself, refusing to be broken even in the face of certain death. "You will tell me," Colonel Beaumont had said, standing over Elijah with a riding crop in his hand, "exactly how long this correspondence has been going on, and whether you have laid so much as a finger on my daughter." Elijah had looked up at his master with steady eyes. "I have never touched Miss Catherine inappropriately, sir. Our relationship has been one of minds and hearts, nothing more." "Minds and hearts?" the colonel had repeated, his voice dripping with contempt. "You forget yourself, boy. You have no mind worth considering and no heart that matters. You are property, nothing more." "I am a man," Elijah had replied quietly, "and I love your daughter." The admission had earned him a vicious blow from the riding crop, but he had not cried out. Instead, he had continued to speak, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I know that my love for her is hopeless, and I know that it will cost me my life, but I will not deny it, and I will not apologize for it. Love is the one thing in this world that cannot be owned or controlled, no matter how much power a man may possess." Colonel Beaumont had struck him again and again, but Elijah had refused to recant his words or beg for mercy. Finally, breathing heavily from his exertions, the colonel had stepped back. "You will hang at dawn," he had declared, "and perhaps your death will serve as a reminder to others of what happens when they forget their place." As Elijah was dragged away to the plantation's makeshift jail, he had caught a glimpse of Catherine at her window. Even across the distance, he could see the tears streaming down her face, and he had tried to convey with his eyes all the love and comfort he could not speak aloud. That night, as Elijah sat in chains awaiting his execution, He reflected on the choices that had brought him to this moment. He could not regret loving Catherine, for she had shown him a glimpse of what life could be like when two souls connected across all barriers. He could not regret learning to read and write, for literacy had given him the tools to express his deepest thoughts and feelings. What he regretted was the pain his love had brought to Catherine, who would have to live with the knowledge that her feelings had cost a man his life. He hoped that someday she would understand that he had chosen love over safety, truth over survival, and that he considered it a fair trade. As the first light of dawn began to creep across the sky, Elijah heard the sound of footsteps approaching his cell. His time had come, but he would face death as he had faced life, with dignity, courage, and the unshakable knowledge that love, however briefly experienced, was worth any price. The love letters that had sealed his fate lay as evidence of his crime, but they also stood as testament to something that transcended the brutal realities of slavery, the capacity of the human heart to love across any divide, no matter how insurmountable it might seem. The news of Elijah's impending execution spread through Charleston society like wildfire, creating a scandal that threatened to consume not only the Beaumont family, but the very foundations of the social order they represented. What had begun as a private family matter had quickly escalated into a public spectacle that would test the limits of Southern justice and expose the contradictions at the heart of antebellum society. Colonel Beaumont had initially intended to handle the matter quietly, executing Elijah at dawn and sending Catherine away to relatives in Virginia until the scandal died down. However, the discovery of the letters had coincided with the arrival of Judge Cornelius Blackwood, a circuit judge known throughout South Carolina for his strict interpretation of the law and his theatrical approach to justice. Judge Blackwood, a man in his 60s with silver hair and piercing blue eyes, had been a guest at Magnolia Grove when the scandal broke. Upon learning of the situation, he'd insisted that proper legal procedures be followed, arguing that such a serious breach of social order required a formal trial to serve as an example to others. "Colonel Beaumont," the judge had said over breakfast, his voice carrying the authority of decades on the bench, "I understand your desire to handle this matter privately, but we cannot allow personal considerations to override the law. This slave has committed crimes against the natural order of society, and his trial must be conducted in full view of the public, to demonstrate that justice will be swift and certain." The colonel had been reluctant to subject his family to further public scrutiny, but he understood the judge's reasoning. The letters between Elijah and Catherine represented more than a simple case of a slave overstepping his bounds. They challenged the fundamental assumptions about race, class, and social hierarchy that kept Southern society functioning. "Very well," the colonel had agreed, "but I want this matter concluded quickly. The longer it drags on, the more damage it does to my family's reputation." "Justice cannot be rushed," Judge Blackwood had replied, "but it can be thorough. I propose we hold the trial in 3 days' time in the courthouse at Charleston. That will give us time to prepare the case properly and ensure that the proceedings serve their intended purpose." The announcement of the trial had created a sensation throughout the region. Never before had a slave been formally tried for the crime of loving a white woman, and the case attracted attention from as far away as Richmond and Atlanta. Newspaper reporters descended upon Charleston, eager to cover what promised to be one of the most sensational trials in Southern legal history. Catherine, meanwhile, remained locked in her room at Magnolia Grove, forbidden from seeing visitors or communicating with the outside world. Her father had made it clear that she would not be called to testify, as her presence in the courtroom would only add to the family's humiliation. Instead, the letters themselves would serve as the primary evidence against Elijah. "You will remain here until this matter is concluded," Colonel Beaumont had told his daughter through her locked door, "and then you will be sent to your aunt in Richmond, where you will remain until I can arrange a suitable marriage to restore our family's honor." Catherine had begged to be allowed to see Elijah one last time, to speak on his behalf at the trial, but her pleas had fallen on deaf ears. Her father viewed her as much a victim as a participant in the scandal, corrupted by the unnatural influence of an educated slave who had forgotten his place in the natural order. As the day of the trial approached, Elijah was transferred from the plantation jail to the Charleston courthouse, where he was held in a cell beneath the building. The transfer had been conducted under heavy guard, as rumors had spread that abolitionists from the North might attempt to free him. In reality, no such rescue attempt was planned, but the authorities were taking no chances. The courthouse itself was an imposing Greek revival structure that symbolized the majesty of Southern law and order. Its white columns and marble steps had witnessed countless trials over the decades, but none quite like the one that was about to unfold. By the morning of the trial, crowds had gathered outside the building, drawn by curiosity and the promise of witnessing history in the making. Judge Blackwood had appointed a young lawyer named Robert Morrison to serve as Elijah's defense counsel, though Morrison understood that his role was largely ceremonial. The evidence against his client was overwhelming, and the social pressure to convict was enormous. Still, Morrison was a man of principle who believed that even a slave deserved competent representation. "Elijah," Morrison had said during their first meeting in the courthouse cell, "I want you to understand that our options are extremely limited. The letters provide clear evidence of your relationship with Miss Beaumont, and the law in South Carolina is unambiguous about such matters." "I understand, sir," Elijah had replied calmly. "I do not expect miracles. I only ask that you allow me to speak the truth about my feelings and my actions. The truth in this case may not serve you well," Morrison had warned. "If you were to express remorse, to claim that you were led astray, or that your actions were the result of temporary madness, the court might be inclined toward mercy." Elijah had shaken his head firmly. "I will not lie about my love for Miss Catherine, nor will I pretend that I am anything less than a man capable of genuine feeling. If that costs me my life, so be it." Morrison had been struck by his client's dignity and intelligence, qualities that made the injustice of his situation all the more apparent. Here was a man who, in any other circumstances, would have been considered a gentleman of refinement and education. Yet the accident of his birth and the color of his skin had condemned him to bondage and now to death. The prosecution was led by District Attorney Hamilton Crenshaw, an ambitious politician who saw the case as an opportunity to advance his career by demonstrating his commitment to maintaining social order. Crenshaw had built his reputation on his fierce prosecution of crimes against the established order, and he viewed Elijah's case as a chance to send a clear message about the consequences of challenging racial boundaries. On the morning of the trial, the courthouse was packed with spectators representing every level of Charleston society. Wealthy planters sat alongside merchants and artisans, all united in their desire to see justice done according to their understanding of natural law. The few abolitionists who had managed to gain entry sat in tense silence, knowing that any expression of sympathy for the defendant could result in violence. Judge Blackwood called the court to order with a gravity befitting the occasion. "We are gathered here today," he announced to the packed courtroom, "to try the case of the state of South Carolina versus Elijah, a slave belonging to Colonel Harrison Beaumont, on charges of criminal correspondence with a white woman and violation of the natural order established by God and law." The reading of the charges was followed by the presentation of evidence, beginning with the letters themselves. District Attorney Crenshaw read selected passages aloud, his voice dripping with contempt as he recited words of love that had been written in secret and discovered in shame. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Crenshaw declared, "these letters represent nothing less than an assault upon the very foundations of our civilization. Here we see a slave, a piece of property, daring to address his master's daughter as an equal, expressing feelings that nature itself forbids him to possess. The prosecutor's opening statement was a masterpiece of legal theatre designed to inflame the passions of the jury and the spectators. He spoke of the sacred nature of white womanhood, the divine order that placed the races in their proper spheres, and the catastrophic consequences that would follow if such transgressions were allowed to go unpunished. "If we permit this crime to pass without the ultimate penalty," Crenshaw concluded, "we invite chaos and destruction upon our entire way of life. The defendant must hang, not merely as punishment for his individual crime, but as a warning to all who would dare to upset the natural order that God has established." When Morrison rose to present the defense, he faced a hostile courtroom and an impossible task. His strategy was to humanize his client without challenging the fundamental assumptions of the society that was judging him, a delicate balance that required considerable skill. "Gentlemen of the jury," Morrison began, "I do not stand before you today to excuse the actions of my client or to challenge the laws of our state. I stand here to ask you to consider the full circumstances of this case and to remember that justice must be tempered with mercy." Morrison's defense focused on Elijah's exceptional education and the unusual circumstances that had led to his relationship with Catherine. He portrayed his client not as a dangerous criminal, but as a man whose intelligence had led him astray, whose education had filled him with ideas above his station. "My client is guilty of forgetting his place," Morrison argued, but this forgetting was not born of malice or criminal intent. It was born of a mind that had been exposed to learning and literature, influences that perhaps should never have been permitted, but which, once acquired, led inevitably to the tragedy we see before us today. The defense attorney called several witnesses to testify to Elijah's character, including the plantation's overseer and several fellow slaves who spoke of his intelligence, his kindness, and his previous good behavior. But these testimonials, while moving, could not overcome the fundamental fact of his guilt under the law. When Elijah himself was called to testify, the courtroom fell silent. This was the moment that everyone had been waiting for. The chance to hear the slave speak in his own defense, to see whether he would show proper remorse or continue to maintain his defiant stance. "Elijah," Judge Blackwood said sternly, "you stand accused of criminal correspondence with a white woman. How do you plead?" Elijah stood straight and tall, his voice clear and steady as he replied, "I am guilty of loving Miss Catherine Beaumont, Your Honor. I am guilty of expressing that love in letters. I am guilty of believing, if only for a moment, that love might transcend the barriers that society has erected between us." A murmur ran through the courtroom at this unexpected response. Most had expected either a plea for mercy or a denial of the charges. Instead, Elijah had chosen to affirm his guilt while simultaneously defending the nobility of his feelings. "Do you show any remorse for your actions?" the judge asked. "I regret the pain that my love has caused Miss Catherine and her family," Elijah replied. "I regret that my feelings have brought scandal upon people who showed me kindness. But I cannot regret loving her, for love is the most human of all emotions, and to deny it would be to deny my own humanity." The courtroom erupted in angry shouts and calls for immediate execution, but Judge Blackwood restored order with his gavel. The trial would continue according to proper legal procedures, regardless of the crowd's bloodthirst. As the day wore on and the evidence was presented in full, the outcome became increasingly certain. The letters provided irrefutable proof of Elijah's guilt, and his own testimony had eliminated any possibility of mercy. When the jury retired to deliberate, few doubted what their verdict would be. The trial had become more than a simple criminal proceeding. It had become a referendum on the nature of love, humanity, and social order in the antebellum South. And as the sun set over Charleston, everyone in the courthouse knew that only one verdict was possible in a society built upon the fundamental inequality of the races. In the 3 months before their discovery, the letters exchanged between Elijah and Catherine had evolved from tentative intellectual discourse to passionate declarations of love that would ultimately seal both their fates. Hidden in the hollow of an ancient oak tree beside the creek that meandered through Magnolia Grove, these forbidden correspondences represented not just a romance, but a revolution of the heart that challenged every assumption of antebellum Southern society. The first letter, written by Catherine in her careful feminine script, had been innocent enough. "Dear Elijah, I find myself thinking often of our conversation yesterday about Mr. Wordsworth's poetry. Your insights into the relationship between nature and the human soul were quite profound. I have enclosed a volume of his complete works, which I hope you will find enlightening. I look forward to discussing your thoughts when next we meet in the garden. Respectfully, Catherine Beaumont." Elijah's response had been formal and deferential, yet it revealed the depth of his education and the elegance of his mind. "Dear Miss Catherine, I am deeply grateful for your kindness in sharing Mr. Wordsworth's poetry with me. His words speak to something fundamental about the human experience that transcends all artificial boundaries. I was particularly moved by his observation that the child is father of the man, which suggests that our essential nature is formed in innocence before society teaches us whom we may love and whom we must fear. I return the book with my sincere thanks and hope that I have not presumed too much in sharing these thoughts. Your humble servant, Elijah." As the weeks passed, the letters grew longer and more personal. Catherine began to share her frustrations with the limitations placed upon her as a woman of her class, while Elijah revealed his dreams of freedom and his struggles with the contradiction between his educated mind and his enslaved body. "My dear Elijah," Catherine had written in her 5th letter, "I confess that I find our correspondence more stimulating than any conversation I have had with the young gentlemen whom my father considers suitable companions. They speak only of horses, hunting, and politics, while you discuss philosophy, literature, and the deeper questions of human existence. Is it wrong of me to wish that society allowed for friendships based on intellectual compatibility rather than accidents of birth?" Elijah's response had been careful, but revealing. "Dear Miss Catherine, I am honored by your confidence and share your frustration with the artificial barriers that prevent true communion between kindred spirits. In my reading, I have learned that in ancient times, philosophers believed that souls were divided before birth and spent their earthly existence searching for their other half. Perhaps what we have found in each other is simply the recognition of complementary minds, regardless of the circumstances that fate has imposed upon us." The turning point in their correspondence had come in late summer, when Catherine had written with unusual candor about her feelings. "Dearest Elijah, I can no longer pretend that my feelings for you are merely those of intellectual friendship. When I read your letters, my heart races in a way that it never has before. When I see you in the garden, I find myself counting the hours until we can speak again. I know that these feelings are forbidden, that society would condemn us both if they were known, but I cannot deny what is in my heart. Tell me honestly, do you feel anything similar, or am I alone in this impossible affection?" Elijah had struggled for days before responding to Catherine's confession. He understood better than she did the deadly consequences that could follow if their feelings were discovered. Yet he found himself unable to lie to her or to deny the love that had grown in his heart despite all reason and caution. "My beloved Catherine," he had finally written, "your letter has filled me with both joy and terror. Joy, because you have given voice to feelings that I have carried in secret for weeks. Terror, because I know that love between us can only lead to tragedy. Yet I cannot bring myself to lie to you or to deny what my heart knows to be true. I love you with a depth and intensity that surprises even me. I love your mind, your spirit, your kindness, and your courage in reaching across the chasm that society has placed between us. I know that this love is hopeless, that it can never be openly acknowledged or fulfilled, but it exists nonetheless, as real and powerful as any force in nature. From that point forward, their letters had become increasingly passionate and intimate, though they maintained the boundaries of propriety even in their written words. They shared their dreams, their fears, and their growing certainty that they had found in each other something rare and precious. Catherine had written of her plans to travel north after her marriage, hoping to find a more enlightened society where their love might be possible. Elijah had gently discouraged such fantasies while expressing his own impossible dreams of freedom and education. "My darling Catherine," he had written in one of his most eloquent letters, "you speak of a world where love might triumph over prejudice, and I share your hope that such a world might someday exist, but we must live in the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. I am a slave, and you are the daughter of my master. These are facts that no amount of love can change. Yet I would rather love you hopelessly than live without having known what it means to connect so completely with another soul." Catherine's responses had grown increasingly desperate as she realized the impossibility of their situation. "Beloved Elijah, I lie awake at night, imagining a different world where we could be together openly, where your intelligence and character would be recognized regardless of your birth. I know that such dreams are futile, but they are all that sustain me. Sometimes I think it would be better if we had never met, if I had never known what it felt like to find my perfect complement in someone I can never have. But then I read your letters again, and I know that even this impossible love is better than the empty existence I lived before." The final exchange of letters had taken place just days before their discovery. Catherine had written with unusual urgency, "My dearest love, I fear that we are being watched. Thomas has been asking strange questions about my walks in the garden, and I have noticed him following me on several occasions. We must be more careful than ever. Perhaps we should stop writing for a while, until suspicion dies down. The thought of not communicating with you is unbearable, but the alternative, discovery and its consequences, is far worse." Elijah's final letter had been prophetic in its acceptance of their likely fate. "My beloved Catherine, I share your fears about discovery, but I find that I cannot bring myself to stop writing to you. These letters have become the most precious part of my existence, the only time when I can be completely honest about my feelings and my dreams. If we are discovered, I will face whatever consequences come with the knowledge that I have experienced something beautiful and pure in a life that has known little of either. You have shown me what it means to be truly seen and valued for who I am, rather than what I am. That gift is worth any price." When Thomas Beaumont had discovered the cache of letters in the oak tree, he had found more than 30 carefully preserved pieces of correspondence spanning 3 months of clandestine romance. The letters revealed not just the depth of feeling between Elijah and Catherine, but the sophistication of their minds and the genuine compatibility of their souls. Reading the letters in sequence, one could trace the evolution of their relationship from tentative friendship to passionate love. More disturbing to the white authorities who would later examine them was the evidence they provided of Elijah's remarkable education and intelligence. These were not the crude scribblings of an ignorant field hand, but the elegant prose of a man who could quote Shakespeare, discuss philosophy, and express complex emotions with remarkable eloquence. The letters also revealed Catherine's growing disillusionment with the society that had raised her. Her correspondence showed a young woman questioning the fundamental assumptions of her world, wondering why intelligence and character should matter less than race and class in determining human worth. During the trial, District Attorney Crenshaw had read selected passages aloud to the jury, choosing excerpts that emphasized the transgressive nature of the relationship while downplaying the genuine affection and intellectual compatibility that the letters revealed. He focused particularly on passages where Elijah had addressed Catherine as an equal, treating such presumption as evidence of his dangerous disregard for social order. Note how the defendant addresses Miss Beaumont, Crenshaw had declared, waving one of the letters before the jury. He calls her beloved and darling, as if he were her equal, as if the natural barriers between the races meant nothing to him. This is not mere affection, gentlemen. This is revolution disguised as romance. Defense attorney Morrison had attempted to present the letters in a different light, emphasizing their literary quality and the obvious sincerity of feeling they contained. But in a society built upon racial hierarchy, such arguments fell on deaf ears. These letters reveal a man of exceptional education and sensitivity, Morrison had argued. They show that my client's feelings for Miss Beaumont were genuine and respectful, not the crude desires that the prosecution would have you believe. If love is a crime, then my client is guilty. But if we are to judge him, let us judge him for what he truly is, a man whose only crime was loving someone he could never have. The letters themselves had become exhibits in the trial, passed among the jury members, and read aloud in court. Each word that had been written in love was now being used as evidence of criminal intent, each expression of affection transformed into proof of dangerous rebellion against the natural order. As Elijah sat in the defendant's chair, listening to his most private thoughts being dissected and condemned, he reflected on the power of written words to both elevate and destroy. The same literacy that had allowed him to express his love for Catherine had also provided the evidence that would condemn him to death. Yet he could not bring himself to regret the letters or the love they represented. In a life circumscribed by bondage and brutality, his correspondence with Catherine had been a glimpse of what human connection could be when it transcended artificial barriers. The letters had given voice to feelings that might otherwise have remained forever unspoken, and in doing so, they had affirmed his humanity in a world that denied it. The irony was not lost on him that the very education that white society feared to give slaves, the ability to read and write, had enabled him to create a record of love that would outlast his life. Long after he was gone, the letters would remain as testimony to the fact that love could bloom even in the most unlikely circumstances, and that the human heart recognized no boundaries save those imposed by fear and prejudice. As the trial moved toward its inevitable conclusion, Elijah found comfort in knowing that his words would survive him, that somewhere in the future, perhaps in a more enlightened time, someone might read his letters and understand that he had been more than just a slave who forgot his place. He had been a man who dared to love. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning to the packed Charleston courthouse with their verdict. The speed of their decision surprised no one. In a case where the evidence was so clear and the social stakes so high, there had never been any real doubt about the outcome. As the 12 white men filed back into the jury box, their faces grave with the weight of their decision, a hush fell over the courtroom that had been buzzing with conversation and speculation. Judge Blackwood called the court to order, with 3 sharp raps of his gavel. "Gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" The foreman, a prosperous Charleston merchant named William Hartwell, rose slowly to his feet. "We have, Your Honor." "How do you find the defendant, Elijah, on the charge of criminal correspondence with a white woman?" "Guilty, Your Honor." "And how do you find the defendant on the charge of violation of the natural order established by God and law?" "Guilty, Your Honor." A roar of approval erupted from the spectators, but Judge Blackwood quickly restored order. The formal reading of the verdict was followed by the even more solemn ritual of sentencing. Elijah was ordered to stand as the judge prepared to pronounce his fate. "Elijah," Judge Blackwood intoned, his voice carrying the full authority of Southern law and tradition, "you have been found guilty of crimes that strike at the very heart of our civilization. Your actions represent not merely a personal transgression, but an assault upon the divine order that governs relations between the races." The judge paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the courtroom. "The court recognizes that you possess an unusual degree of education for one of your station, and it is precisely this education that makes your crimes so heinous. You knew better than to transgress the boundaries that separate your race from that of your betters, yet you chose to do so anyway. Elijah stood straight and tall as he listened to the judge's words, his face showing no emotion despite the death sentence he knew was coming. In the gallery, several spectators leaned forward, eager to see if the condemned man would break down or beg for mercy. "The sentence of this court," Judge Blackwood continued, "is that you shall be hanged by the neck until dead, said execution to take place at dawn 3 days hence in the public square of Charleston, as an example to all who would dare to forget their place in the natural order of things." The courtroom erupted again, this time in a mixture of cheers and scattered protests from the few abolitionists who had managed to gain entry. Elijah closed his eyes briefly, then opened them and looked directly at Judge Blackwood. "Your Honor," he said in a clear, steady voice, "I accept this sentence with the knowledge that I have committed no crime against God or nature, only against the laws of men who fear what they do not understand." The audacity of this final statement sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Even facing death, Elijah refused to show the proper deference or express the expected remorse. Judge Blackwood's face flushed with anger, but he maintained his judicial composure. "Remove the prisoner," he ordered, and Elijah was led away in chains to await his execution. News of the verdict and sentence spread rapidly throughout Charleston and beyond. The case had attracted national attention, with northern newspapers condemning the proceedings as a travesty of justice, while southern publications praised the swift action taken to preserve social order. The story of the educated slave who had dared to love his master's daughter became a symbol of the growing tensions that would soon tear the nation apart. At Magnolia Grove, Catherine received word of the verdict while still confined to her room. Her father had forbidden her from attending the trial, but she had learned of its progress through whispered conversations with sympathetic servants. When the news of Elijah's death sentence reached her, she collapsed in grief, her cries of anguish echoing through the plantation house. "This is madness," she sobbed to her mother, who had come to comfort her. "They're going to kill him for loving me. How can that be justice?" Mrs. Beaumont, a gentle woman who had been horrified by the scandal but retained some sympathy for her daughter's plight, tried to offer what comfort she could. "Catherine, dear, you must understand that some boundaries cannot be crossed. What happened between you and that man, it was never meant to be." "But why?" Catherine demanded through her tears. "Why should the color of his skin matter more than the content of his character? He's more intelligent and sensitive than any of the men Father wants me to marry. He's shown me more respect and kindness than I've ever received from anyone else." "Because that's the way God made the world," her mother replied, though her voice lacked conviction. "There are natural orders that must be maintained, or society itself would collapse." Catherine turned away from her mother, staring out the window toward the creek, where she and Elijah had shared so many conversations. "Then perhaps society deserves to collapse," she whispered. In Charleston, preparations for the execution proceeded with grim efficiency. A scaffold was erected in the public square, and notices were posted throughout the city announcing the time and place of the hanging. The authorities expected a large crowd, as public executions were both entertainment and moral instruction for the populace. Elijah spent his final days in a cell beneath the courthouse, attended by a Methodist minister who had volunteered to provide spiritual comfort to the condemned man. The Reverend Samuel Whitfield was a young clergyman who had recently arrived in Charleston from Virginia, and he was troubled by the circumstances of Elijah's case. "My son," the minister said during one of their conversations, "I have read the letters that were presented as evidence in your trial. They reveal a man of deep faith and genuine feeling. I cannot help but wonder if justice has truly been served." Elijah looked up from the Bible he had been reading. "Reverend Whitfield, I appreciate your kindness, but I have made my peace with what is to come. I loved Catherine Beaumont with all my heart, and I would make the same choice again if given the opportunity. But surely you understand that such love was impossible from the beginning." "I understand that society has declared it impossible," Elijah replied. But I have read the same Bible you carry, and I have found nothing in Christ's teachings that suggests love should be limited by the color of one's skin. Did not Jesus himself say that the greatest commandment is to love one another?" The minister struggled with this theological challenge. "Yes, but surely there are different kinds of love, appropriate to different relationships." "Is there?" Elijah asked gently. "When I read the Song of Solomon, I see no mention of race or class. When I read Paul's letters about love being patient and kind, I see no exceptions based on social station. Perhaps the problem is not with love itself, but with a society that has forgotten how to recognize love when it appears in unexpected forms." These conversations with the condemned man left Reverend Whitfield deeply troubled. He had come to Charleston expecting to minister to a criminal, but had found instead a man of remarkable faith and intelligence whose only crime had been loving someone he was forbidden to love. On the night before the execution, Catherine made a desperate attempt to see Elijah one last time. Disguising herself in servant's clothing, she slipped out of Magnolia Grove and made her way to Charleston under cover of darkness. Her plan was to bribe the guards and gain entry to Elijah's cell, but she was recognized and apprehended before she could reach the courthouse. The news of Catherine's attempted visit reached Elijah through Reverend Whitfield, who had been present when she was brought to the courthouse. "She tried to see you," the minister told him. "The young lady was quite distraught when they turned her away." Elijah closed his eyes, imagining Catherine's desperation and grief. "I hope she will not blame herself for what happens tomorrow. This was my choice, and mine alone." "She asked me to give you this," the minister said, producing a small piece of paper that Catherine had managed to slip to him before being taken away. Elijah unfolded the paper with trembling hands and read Catherine's final message to him. "My beloved Elijah, I would give anything to take your place tomorrow. You are dying for a love that I share completely, and I will carry the guilt of that for the rest of my life. Please know that you have shown me what it means to love truly and completely, without reservation or condition. I will never forget you, and I will never love another as I have loved you. Until we meet again in a better world, I remain forever yours, Catherine." Elijah pressed the letter to his heart, then carefully folded it and placed it in his shirt pocket, next to his heart. "Thank you, Reverend. Please tell her, if you ever have the opportunity, that she has given me the greatest gift any man could receive, the knowledge that I was truly loved." As dawn approached on the day of execution, crowds began gathering in the public square. The scaffold stood ready, its noose swaying slightly in the morning breeze. Vendors sold food and drink to the spectators, treating the occasion as a combination of moral lesson and public entertainment. Elijah was awakened before sunrise and given a final meal, which he barely touched. He spent his last hour in prayer and meditation, finding peace in the knowledge that he would soon be free from the bonds of slavery, even if that freedom came through death. As the sun rose over Charleston, casting long shadows across the square, the time for his execution arrived. Elijah was led from his cell to a waiting cart that would carry him to the scaffold. Despite the early hour, hundreds of people had already gathered to witness his death. The condemned man sat straight and dignified in the cart, his eyes fixed on the horizon rather than the hostile faces of the crowd. As the cart made its way slowly through the streets of Charleston, some spectators shouted curses and threats while others watched in silence, perhaps troubled by their own thoughts about justice and mercy. At the scaffold, Elijah was offered the opportunity to make a final statement. He looked out over the crowd, then up at the sky where the morning sun was painting the clouds in shades of gold and pink. "I stand before you today," he said in a clear, strong voice that carried across the square, "not as a criminal, but as a man who dared to love. I am guilty of nothing more than believing that the human heart recognizes no boundaries save those imposed by fear and hatred. I die knowing that love is stronger than death, and that someday, in a better world than this one, such love will be celebrated rather than condemned. The crowd stirred restlessly at these words, some calling for him to be silent, others listening with unexpected attention. Judge Blackwood, who was present to witness the execution, nodded to the executioner to proceed. As the noose was placed around his neck, Elijah's final thought was of Catherine and of the love that had transformed his life, even as it ended it. He faced death with the same dignity and courage that had characterized his life, secure in the knowledge that he had chosen love over safety, truth over survival. The trapdoor opened, and Elijah's earthly journey came to an end. But his story, and the love letters that had condemned him, would live on as testimony to the power of love to transcend even the most insurmountable barriers. 5 years after Elijah's execution, the world that had condemned him to death was itself dying in the flames of civil war. The rigid social order that had made their love impossible was crumbling under the weight of its own contradictions, and the letters that had once served as evidence of criminal behavior were now being read as prophetic testimony to the humanity that slavery had tried to deny. Catherine Beaumont, now Catherine Morrison, after a loveless marriage arranged by her father to restore the family's honor, sat in the parlor of her Richmond home, carefully preserving the letters that had cost Elijah his life. She had managed to retrieve them from the courthouse records through the intervention of sympathetic friends, and she guarded them as her most precious possessions. The years since Elijah's death had not been kind to Catherine. The forced marriage to a wealthy Virginia planter had provided her with social respectability, but no happiness. Her husband, Richard Morrison, was a cold and distant man who viewed his wife as little more than an ornament to his social position. He knew nothing of her past scandal, having been told only that she had suffered a nervous breakdown that required a change of scenery. Catherine had borne him 2 children, but she found little joy in motherhood when her heart remained buried with the man who had died for loving her. She went through the motions of her prescribed social role, attending parties and managing her household, but those who knew her well could see that something vital had died within her on that Charleston morning when Elijah faced the gallows. The war had brought unexpected changes to Catherine's world. As Union forces advanced deeper into Virginia, many of the enslaved people on her husband's plantation had fled to freedom, taking with them the labor that sustained the plantation economy. Richard Morrison had joined the Confederate Army as a colonel, leaving Catherine to manage the estate with a dwindling workforce and diminishing resources. It was during this period of upheaval that Catherine encountered someone who would help her understand the broader significance of her lost love. Dr. Marcus Freeman was a free black physician from Philadelphia who had come south with the Union Army to provide medical care to newly freed slaves. When he was wounded in a skirmish near Richmond, he was brought to the Morrison plantation to recover, as it was the nearest facility with adequate medical supplies. Catherine's first instinct was to turn the wounded man away, fearing the social consequences of harboring a black Union officer. But something in Dr. Freeman's dignified bearing and obvious education reminded her powerfully of Elijah, and she found herself unable to refuse him aid. "Mrs. Morrison," Dr. Freeman said as Catherine tended his wounds, "I want you to know that I understand the risk you're taking in helping me. In these times, such kindness across racial lines can be dangerous." Catherine paused in her work, studying the man's intelligent face. "Dr. Freeman, may I ask you something? Do you believe that love between the races is possible, or is it merely a romantic delusion?" The question surprised Dr. Freeman, who had not expected such a philosophical inquiry from a Southern plantation mistress. "I believe, Mrs. Morrison, that love recognizes no boundaries except those imposed by human prejudice. I have seen marriages between people of different races that were based on genuine affection and mutual respect. The question is not whether such love is possible, but whether society is willing to accept it. And if society is not willing, then those who love must choose between their hearts and their safety. Some choose safety and live with regret. Others choose love and pay the ultimate price. Catherine's eyes filled with tears as she thought of Elijah's choice and its consequences. And which choice do you think is the right one, Doctor? Freeman studied her carefully, sensing that this was more than an abstract discussion. I think, Mrs. Morrison, that a life lived without love is not truly a life at all. Those who choose love, even when it leads to tragedy, at least die knowing that they have experienced something real and beautiful. That evening, Catherine made a decision that would have seemed impossible to her just days earlier. She brought Dr. Freeman the collection of letters that she had preserved so carefully, and she told him the story of her love for Elijah and the price he had paid for daring to love her in return. Dr. Freeman read the letters with growing amazement, recognizing in them a literary and emotional sophistication that challenged every stereotype about enslaved people. Mrs. Morrison, he said when he had finished reading, these letters are extraordinary. They reveal a man of remarkable intelligence and sensitivity. He was remarkable, Catherine agreed, but the world saw only a slave who had forgotten his place. The world was wrong, Dr. Freeman said firmly. These letters prove that slavery could not crush the human spirit, no matter how hard it tried. Your Elijah was a poet, a philosopher, and a man of deep feeling. His words deserve to be preserved and shared. Shared. Catherine was alarmed at the suggestion. But that would mean revealing what happened, admitting my part in his death. Mrs. Morrison, your Elijah died because he refused to deny his humanity. Don't you think his sacrifice deserves to be remembered? Don't you think the world needs to know that love like yours existed even in the darkest times? Dr. Freeman's words planted a seed in Catherine's mind that would grow over the following months. As the war continued and the institution of slavery crumbled around them, she began to see Elijah's death not as a personal tragedy, but as part of a larger struggle for human dignity and recognition. When Richmond fell to Union forces in April 1865, Catherine found herself in a world transformed. The slaves on her husband's plantation were now free, and many chose to remain as paid workers rather than seek their fortunes elsewhere. Among them was an elderly man named Samuel, who had known Elijah during his brief time at Magnolia Grove before being sold to the Morrison plantation. "Miss Catherine," Samuel said when he learned of her connection to Elijah, "that man was special. He could read and write better than most white folks, and he had a way of making everyone around him feel like they mattered. When we heard what happened to him, we all knew it was because he dared to be more than what they wanted him to be." "Do you think he was wrong to love me?" Catherine asked. Samuel considered the question carefully. "Miss Catherine, I think Elijah was the bravest man I ever knew. He could have kept his head down, stayed quiet, and lived a long life in chains. Instead, he chose to love, even knowing it would cost him everything. That takes a special kind of courage." These conversations with Dr. Freeman and Samuel convinced Catherine that Elijah's story needed to be told. In 1866, she began working on a book that would combine his letters with her own account of their relationship and its tragic conclusion. The project was both cathartic and painful, forcing her to relive every moment of their brief time together. The book, titled Letters from the Heart, A True Account of Love Across the Color Line, was published in 1867 by a small Boston publishing house that specialized in abolitionist literature. Catherine wrote under the pseudonym A Southern Lady, fearing the social consequences of revealing her identity. The book created a sensation in both the North and South, though for very different reasons. Northern readers saw it as confirmation of slavery's moral bankruptcy and evidence of the humanity that the institution had tried to deny. Southern readers, those who read it at all, viewed it as a betrayal of everything they held sacred. The most powerful response came from the African American community, where Elijah's letters were read as proof that education and refinement were not the exclusive province of the white race. Frederick Douglass himself wrote a review of the book, praising Elijah's eloquence and Catherine's courage in sharing their story. "These letters," Douglass wrote, reveal a man whose mind was as free as his body was enslaved. They prove that no chains can bind the human spirit when it is nourished by love and learning. Mr. Elijah died a slave-in-law, but he lived and loved as a free man in his heart. The book's success led to speaking engagements for Catherine, who gradually became more comfortable revealing her identity as the author. She traveled throughout the North, sharing Elijah's story and advocating for the education of freed slaves. Her talks were often emotional affairs, as she read passages from his letters and described the man who had changed her understanding of love and humanity. "Elijah taught me," she would tell her audiences, "that love is not about the color of one's skin or the circumstances of one's birth. It is about the recognition of a kindred spirit, the meeting of minds and hearts that transcends all artificial barriers." He died for that belief, and I have spent the rest of my life trying to honor his memory. Catherine's advocacy work brought her into contact with other interracial couples who had found love despite social opposition. She became a patron of schools for freed slaves and a supporter of civil rights legislation. Her transformation from a sheltered plantation daughter to a civil rights advocate was complete. In 1870, Catherine received an unexpected visitor at her Richmond home. A young black woman named Sarah Washington had traveled from Charleston specifically to meet her, carrying with her a worn copy of Letters from the Heart and a story that would profoundly move Catherine. "Mrs. Morrison," Sarah said as they sat in Catherine's parlor, "I wanted to thank you for writing about Elijah. You see, he was my teacher." Catherine's heart raced at this unexpected connection to her lost love. "Your teacher?" "Yes, Mom. Before he came to your father's plantation, Elijah spent 2 years at the Hartwell place where my family was enslaved. He taught a group of us children to read and write in secret, using the Bible and whatever books he could find. When he was sold to Magnolia Grove, we thought we'd never see him again." Sarah reached into her bag and pulled out a small leather-bound journal. "He gave me this before he left, told me to keep writing and learning no matter what happened. When I heard about his trial and execution, I thought his sacrifice had been for nothing. But your book showed me that his love for you was just another form of the same courage that made him risk his life to educate us." Catherine accepted the journal with trembling hands, recognizing Elijah's careful handwriting on its pages. It contained poetry, philosophical reflections, and teaching notes that revealed yet another dimension of the man she had loved. "He wrote about you," Sarah continued, "not by name, but he described meeting someone who made him believe that understanding between the races was possible. He said that love had the power to break down walls that hatred had built." This revelation led Catherine to a new understanding of Elijah's significance. He had not been simply a man who loved unwisely, but an educator, a leader, and a symbol of resistance against the dehumanization of slavery. His letters to her were just one expression of a broader commitment to human dignity and connection. Inspired by this discovery, Catherine began collecting stories from other people who had known Elijah. She learned that he had taught dozens of enslaved people to read, that he had served as an informal counselor and mediator in disputes, and that his execution had become a rallying point for those who dreamed of freedom. In 1872, Catherine published a second book, The Teacher and the Letters, the complete story of Elijah's legacy. This volume included not only their correspondence, but also testimonies from his former students, examples of his poetry and philosophical writings, and an analysis of his impact on the enslaved community. The book established Elijah as a significant figure in African-American intellectual history, a man whose contributions to education and literature had been overshadowed by the scandal of his death. Universities began including his letters in their curricula, and his story became part of the broader narrative of resistance to slavery. Catherine's own life took on new meaning as she dedicated herself to preserving and promoting Elijah's legacy. She established the Elijah Freeman Educational Foundation, using the surname that Elijah had chosen for himself in his letters. which provided scholarships for African American students and funded schools in the South. In 1875, 10 years after the end of the Civil War, Catherine was invited to speak at the dedication of a new school for black children in Charleston. Standing just blocks from where Elijah had been executed, she addressed a crowd that included many of his former students and their children. Elijah believed, she told the assembled crowd, that education was the key to true freedom. He risked his life to teach others to read and write, and he died believing that love and understanding could overcome hatred and prejudice. This school stands as a monument to his faith in the power of education to transform lives and communities. Udun, the school was named the Elijah Freeman Academy, and a plaque near its entrance bore a quote from one of his letters: "Learning is the one thing they cannot take from a man once he possesses it." Catherine lived to see the turn of the century, witnessing both the progress and setbacks of the post-war era. She saw the passage of the 15th Amendment granting voting rights to black men, but she also witnessed the rise of Jim Crow laws that sought to re-establish racial hierarchy through legal means. Throughout these changing times, she continued to speak and write about Elijah's legacy, adapting his message to new circumstances while maintaining its essential truth, that love and education were the most powerful forces for human liberation. In her final years, Catherine was cared for by Sarah Washington, who had become like a daughter to her. Sarah had used her education to become a teacher herself, carrying on Elijah's work of enlightening young minds. Together, they worked on a final project, a complete collection of Elijah's writings, including letters, poems, and teaching materials that had been preserved by his former students. Catherine died in 1901 at the age of 61, having lived long enough to see the dawn of a new century that would bring both new challenges and new opportunities for racial progress. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people, both black and white, whose lives had been touched by her work and Elijah's legacy. Sarah Washington delivered the eulogy, reading from one of Elijah's final letters: "Love is the one force in this world that cannot be conquered by hatred, cannot be destroyed by violence, and cannot be forgotten by time. It lives on in the hearts of those who have experienced it, and it passes from generation to generation like a sacred flame." The love letters that had once led to the gallows had become a testament to the enduring power of human connection across all barriers. Elijah's words, preserved by Catherine's devotion and shared with the world through her courage, continued to inspire new generations of readers who found in them proof that love could indeed transcend the artificial divisions that society imposed. In the decades that followed, as America struggled with the ongoing legacy of slavery and the continuing fight for civil rights, Elijah and Catherine's story remained relevant and powerful. Their letters were quoted by civil rights leaders, studied by scholars, and treasured by anyone who believed in the possibility of a world where love was stronger than prejudice. The man who had died for loving across racial lines had achieved a kind of immortality through his words, while the woman who had preserved those words had found redemption through dedicating her life to his memory. Together, they had proved that even the most tragic love story could become a source of hope and inspiration for future generations. Their legacy lived on in the schools that bore Elijah's name, in the scholarships that enabled young people to pursue education, and in the hearts of all who read their correspondence and recognized in it the eternal truth that love knows no boundaries save those imposed by fear and ignorance. The love letters that had led to the gallows had ultimately led to something far more powerful, a lasting testament to the triumph of the human spirit over the forces that sought to divide and diminish it. The end. Important notice: this story is completely fictional and created solely for entertainment purposes. All characters, events, situations, and circumstances are products of imagination and do not represent real people, living or dead, or real events. Any similarity to actual people or situations is purely coincidental. This powerful work of historical fiction explores themes of forbidden love, racial injustice, the power of literacy, and the enduring legacy of those who dare to love across societal boundaries. Through Elijah and Catherine's story, it examines the human cost of slavery, the courage required to challenge unjust social norms, and the way that love and education can transcend even the most oppressive circumstances. The narrative demonstrates how individual acts of courage and love can inspire broader social change and create lasting legacies that outlive their creators.